Alright, so today we're going to talk about multiplying integers and taking... Okay, so if it's a positive times a positive, so like 5 times 4, you're going to end up with a positive. If it's a negative times a negative, so negative 1 times a negative 2, you're going to end up with also a positive. And then if it's a negative times a positive, it's a negative. If it's a positive times a negative, it's a negative. So from here, we should realize that if they are the same signs, you end up with a positive. So like if it's a positive times a positive or a negative times a negative, you end up with a positive. But if it has opposite signs, you end up with a negative. So if there's a negative and a positive times together, you will always get a negative. Okay? Some practice. Alright, so looking at number 1, we have a positive times a positive, so right away you should know that since it's the same signs, you keep it positive, and then 8 times 9 is 72. There is your answer. Alright, so moving to number 2, we have a positive times a negative. They are opposite signs, so you end up with a negative, and then you take 7 times 7, just like a normal multiplication problem, and you get 49. Okay, so step 1, identify what sign it's going to be. Step 2, do regular multiplication. Okay, so I have a negative 10 times a positive 4. Negative times a positive gives you a negative because they're opposite signs. 10 times 4 is 40. Okay, negative 5 times a negative 6, with both same signs, they become positive. 5 times 6 is 30. Alright, so we should know from PEMDAS that multiplication, you work left to right, but you should also know by the closure property of multiplication that you could technically multiply any number in this strand in any order. The order does not matter because the closure property of multiplication, but be careful because that does not work for subtraction or division. Okay, so 12 times a negative 1, positive times negative, you get negative. Then we get that 12 because 12 times 1 is that. And then negative 2 times a negative 12. Negative times a negative gives you a positive. 12 times 2 is 24. You do not need this plus sign there, but I just put it just so I remember that it's going to be a positive. Okay, moving on. Another way of thinking of multiplying. If it is more than 2. So if you have an odd number of negatives, right? If you have an odd number of negatives, your answer is going to be negative. If it's an even number of negatives, your answer is going to be positive. So if I look at number 6, I have 1, 2, 3 negative signs. So that's odd. 3 is odd, so odd number. If I look at the odd number of negatives, we would get a negative. So this ending should be a negative, and then you can just multiply it like normal. So 10 times 3 is 30. 30 times 7 is 210. Okay, that is another way of thinking of it. If it's odd number of negatives, it's going to be a negative. If there's even number of negatives, it's going to be a positive. So if I look over here, we only had 2 negatives, so that's 2 is an even number, so it becomes a positive. Looking at number 7, we have negative 20, negative 4, that's 2 negatives, and so I would get an even, so it's going to be a positive since it's even. 0 times anything you should know right away is just going to be 0, so really your answer is just 0. Okay, because 0 cannot be positive or negative. Alright, looking at number 8, we have 1 negative, so 1 is odd, so my answer is negative. 4 times 8 is 32. Then 32 times 3 is 96, so my answer would be negative 96. Alright, evaluate the expression. So you should know from last year that negative 8 squared is the same thing as negative 8 times negative 8. The reason you are timesing that negative 8, that negative sign, is because that whole thing is in parentheses raised to the second power, okay? So negative 8 times negative 8, we have negative times a negative gives you a positive. 8 times 8 is 64. There is your answer, positive 64. Alright, so if I rewrote this negative sign is on the outside, so that negative is not being squared. It's just that 11. So all I'm doing is 11 times 11 and then times that negative. So 11 times 11 is 121, and then I still have that negative out front, okay? So be careful. The difference between these two problems, negative 8 is in the parentheses on number 9, negative 11 is not in the parentheses. So 11 is just being squared, not the negative sign, okay? The whole thing, if you are squaring the negative sign, it will be in parentheses, okay? So this would be negative 5 times negative 5 here, okay? So that becomes a positive and 25, and then 25, and then you still have that 9 over here. 25 times 9 would be 4, 5, carry the 4, 9 times 2 is 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 225. Okay, and it is positive because there are two negative signs, and that is even. Moving to number 12. If you really need to, you can always rewrite these out. So negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2, because that negative is in the parentheses being raised to the third power. And then negative 6. Okay, so I have 4 negatives, so I know it's going to be a positive. 2 times 2 is 4. 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times 6 is 48. So my answer is a positive 48. Alright, last problem. You lose 5 points for every wrong answer in a trivia game. What integer represents the change of your points after answering 8 questions wrong? So you're losing 5 points. So you're going negative 5 points every answer. If you answer 8 wrong, we're going to do that 8 times negative 5. Another way would be negative 5 plus negative 5 plus negative 5 8 times. But since we know multiplication, this is a lot easier. Negative times a positive is a negative. 8 times 5 is 40. So right now you are at negative 40 with 8 questions wrong. Alright, so that is multiplying integers 1.4.